Hey there, and welcome back. It's now finally time to start our big Flexbox project. And this is without a doubt my favorite part of the entire course, because I absolutely love Flexbox. And I'm sure that you're gonna love it too. It's really a revolution in CSS, which makes our lives as CSS developers 100 times easier, believe me. So I'm really excited to teach you Flexbox in this section by building another beautiful project that I coded up just for this course. So I'm going to start by showing you the fundamental concepts and properties behind Flexbox. Then we're going to go through a very brief Flexbox demo on CodePen before we actually start with a big project called Trello. And actually, you're not just going to learn Flexbox in this section. No, I have even more content for you, like custom CSS properties, masks, and SVGs. So without further ado, let's get started. So, before actually using Flexbox in practice, I want to show you the philosophy behind Flexbox and show you the main properties that we can use in order to build Flexbox layouts. So, what is Flexbox actually? Well, Flexbox is a new module in CSS3 that makes it very easy to align elements to one another in different directions and orders, and also to change these alignments if necessary, like for example for responsive design. And this works perfectly even if you have no idea about the dimensions of these elements, because the main idea behind Flexbox is to actually give the container the ability to expand and to shrink elements to best use all the available space. So with Flexbox, we can easily replace float layouts with much less and much more readable and logical code. And because of that, Flexbox completely changes the way that we build layouts, and especially one-dimensional layouts, because that's where Flexbox really shines. For two-dimensional layouts, there are actually better ways of building these, like using CSS grid layouts, as I'm going to show you later in the course. So for all of these reasons, I like to say that Flexbox is a true revolution in CSS. It makes our life as CSS developers so much easier. And there are actually not that many concepts behind Flexbox that you need to understand in order to use it. But what you need to know is this. So first of all, the element on which we use Flexbox is called the Flex container. And all we have to do in order to create a Flex container is to set its display property to Flex. Simple as that. We can also set it to Flex inline, which will then create a Flex container that behaves like an inline element. But I almost never use that one, okay? Then all the direct children of the Flex container are called the Flex items. Now, the direction in which these Flex items are laid out is called the main axis, which is represented with this arrow here. Then the other perpendicular axis is simply called the cross axis. Now, it's important to be aware of these names because we can change the direction of the main axis, and also because there are different ways of aligning elements both along the main axis and the cross axis. So just keep these concepts in mind so that you can fully understand how the different Flexbox related properties work. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about next. So the Flexbox specification defines a couple of properties that we use on the Flex container in order to position and align all the Flex items. And then some other properties that we use directly on the Flex items themselves. Of course, I'm going to show you all of these properties over the course of this section and the project that we built here. But for now, I just want to give you a very brief overview over all of them, so that you can get an idea about how Flexbox works and how many properties there are and how they work. Maybe you can actually print out this slide and use it as a cheat sheet throughout this section. I'm sure that would be really helpful. Okay, but now let's start with the properties that we use on the container. First up, there's one called Flex direction, which specifies in which direction the main axis goes. So I have here the name of the property and then the possible values it can take, where the first one is the initial value. And that means that it's the default, right? So the direction can go as a row, which is the default direction and the one you see in the graphic up there. But it can also go in the opposite direction and even up or down, which will then form a column. Alright? Now, this is obviously much easier to visualize in practice, but again, for now I just want to let you know that these properties exist. Okay, next there is flex wrap, which simply defines if the flex items should wrap into a new line if there is not enough space in the flex container or not. Then we have justify content, and this one defines how the flex items will be aligned along the main axis. Okay, so it's important to know where the main axis is actually. Next, there is the align items property, which is very similar to justify content, with the difference that this one defines how the flex items will be aligned along the cross axis, not the main axis. So align items is many times used together with justify content, and to me, these two are the most important Flexbox properties of all. And then finally, there is align content, which only applies when there is more than one row of flex items. In that case, align content controls how the rows are aligned along the cross axis if there's some empty space. So again, we're going to look at this in code starting in the next lecture, alright? Now, about the properties for flex items, the first one is called align self, which is very similar to align items, but for one individual flex item. So imagine, for example, that we set align items to center, but then we want one of the items to be aligned to the bottom, and so we can use align self for that. Okay? Next up, there is order, which defines the order in which one specific flex item should appear inside the container. And this is really helpful to reorder items, for example, for smaller screens. And now finally, we have three properties that together basically help Flexbox decide on the width of a flex item. So with flex grow, we define how much an item can grow. With flex shrink, we define how much it can shrink. And with flex bases, we can define its base width. And there's actually a shortened property for these, which is simply called flex. And this one is actually the one that should be used. Alright, and all of this is of course much easier to explain with code. And so that's what we're going to start doing right in the next lecture. So, see you there. Welcome back. Let's now try out Flexbox for the very first time in practice. And for now we're going to use CodePen again, because what we want right now is just to write a simple demo, so a simple example. And for that, CodePen is perfect. So just head over to codepen.io and then click here, create a new pen. Okay, so we can hide this JavaScript part here, and then just HTML and CSS. So here in the HTML, let's just create a container with a couple of items in it. And we can actually use the emmet syntax here that I showed you before. So an element called container, and then with items in there. So class item, and then 5 times, hit tab, and that's it. And I'm just gonna put some numbers here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that should be enough for our demo. Now, before writing any actual Flexbox code, let's start by doing our global reset like we usually do. So margin 0, padding 0, and box sizing border box. Okay, now we can hit save here as well. And no, we don't need an account, so let's remove that as well. Okay, and now just some very quick formatting for the container and for the items. So just a quick background color, like this gray color, and give it some padding as well of like 10 pixels. Okay, so no Flexbox code here at all, just some initial styling before we start with Flexbox. Now about the items, let's give them some background color as well. And I'm using this pink color, which is F1425D. Okay. Then some padding, let's say 40 pixels. Some margin as well, like 30 pixels. A white text color. And a bigger text as well. So font size, let's say 40 pixels as well. Okay. Maybe this is a bit too much, 30. But okay, so now we're good to go. So in this lecture, what I want to do is to focus on the FlexBlock properties that we apply on the container. Okay, so basically the first set of properties that I showed you in the last lecture. So the first thing we have to do in order to use Flexbox, remember, is to set the display property to flex. And take a look at what happens immediately. Okay, so these flex items here, they're now automatically side by side, right? Without using any float, without anything. All we did was to set the container to flex, then automatically these child elements become flex items that are displayed side by side. Alright, now the next thing that I want to show you is the property called flex direction. So remember that the default, so the initial value, is the row. So if we say row, nothing changes, right? Because that's the default. But we can also say row reverse. And what happens then is that it inverts the direction of the main axis. So the main axis now goes here from the right side to the left side, where before it was going from the left side to the right side, as I showed you in the diagram in the last lecture, right? And so with this, we inverted the order. And so of course it now starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right? Now the next thing that we can try out is the column. And then we get this result. And so now the flex items are stacked one on top of another. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down here. And then the last one is column reverse. And you can imagine what that one will do. Exactly. Now basically the column starts down here, which means that the main direction is going from here down here, up in the direction up here. Okay? So remember, it's always important to know where the main direction goes. Okay? And now that we experimented with all of these, let's just set it back to row, which is the default. So you can probably imagine that this will be pretty handy, for example, for responsive designs. That, for example, on a smaller screen, we can simply set the flex direction to column, and then the elements will all be one on top of another. So that is flex direction. Next up, I want to show you justify content. So justify content. And remember that this property is used to control how the items should be positioned along the main axis, right? So let's start with center here. And so you see that automatically all the items are now right here in the center of the container. So with that very simple property, we immediately centered the entire content in this container. Just imagine how difficult it would be to create this very simple layout that you see here with a float layout. It would be much harder. So center puts these items here right in the middle of the container, but doesn't do anything to the space that's between them, right? Because the space that we have here is defined by the margin that we have on the items, right? So this margin here defines the space. Let's actually try to remove it. Okay, and then it would look like this, right? So all that justify content does is to put all the items in the center of the flex container, okay? So let me show you another one here, which is space between. And that one is also very exciting. Space between, and that's the result. So what you see now is that the space is evenly distributed between these flex items. So this space and this, and this, it's all the same space. And Flexbox automatically does all these calculations for us and automatically positions the elements like this. And of course, if we change the width here of the browser, then the space that's between these items also adjusts, right? So that makes it really easy to position and align these elements. Now let me once again get rid of that margin here. Okay, because now that makes it even more visible what the space between property here does. Because there's another one which is actually pretty similar, which is called space around. Space around. So basically what space around does here is that it puts the same amount of space on both the left side and the right side of each of the flex items. So what this means is that this total space between these two flex items is double the space that's here on this left side of this item. Alright, now next up there's space evenly, which is also pretty similar to these ones. So space evenly, and as you can see what this one does is that the space is always the same. So this one is the same as this and this and this and all of the spaces here between them. Okay, so while space evenly ensures that the space is always the same between the elements and on the sides of the elements, space around ensures that the amount of space around each element is the same on the left and on the right side, okay? So it's a subtle difference, but it can make a huge difference sometimes. Okay, so space between, space around, and space evenly. I also showed you center already, and so now what we have left is flex end. So when we want them on the right side, okay, and then flex start, which is the default. So these are the options for justify content, and I will leave it at center here, okay? And I will also get rid of this margin. All right, and now the last property I want to show you in this video is align items. So remember that justify content defines how the flex items are aligned along the main axis, and align items here defines how the items are aligned along the cross axis. Okay, now in order for this to work, we actually need one of them to be bigger than all the others, because right now they are already perfectly aligned along the cross axis, right? So along this one here. But if I make one of them bigger than the others, then we can experiment with different alignments across the cross axis, right? So let me just put a new class here. So I2 for item 2. And let's give it some height, like 200 pixels or something. And alright, so you saw already that all of them actually growed, not just the I2 on which we defined the height, right? And that's actually because the initial value on align items is stretch. And so with stretch, this is what happens. So let's just set something else here. So for example, center. And now we see what alignment along the cross axis actually means. Okay, so we have one element that is bigger than all the others, and with align items set to center, we basically center these elements here relative to this one, which is bigger, in the vertical direction, so in the cross axis, right? So now along the cross axis, they are now all nicely centered, like around this line here, right? Now if we set this to flex start, then they will all be aligned here nicely at the top, okay? And the same for flex end, then they will be aligned here to the end. And all of that happens once again along the cross axis, so in here, from up to down. So we saw center, flex start, flex end, and of course the default is stretch. So what does stretch do? Well, as you see, it simply stretches all the other elements to match the height of the highest flex item, okay? So that can be very useful as well. Now there's actually one more, which is called baseline, and for that I'm gonna increase the font size on this one here as well. Or actually I can do it on another one. Let's add one class here called I4. And then in here as well. So font size 70 pixels. Okay, and now if I set this one here to baseline, then what it will do is to basically align the text on these flex items along a line. So if you draw an imaginary line here under these texts, you will see that they are now completely aligned. And if I increase this even more, like say to 90, then they all keep nicely aligned down here along the text, okay? So basically, align items to baseline is to align them to their common text, okay? Now once again, I'm going with center here. And of course, I don't want this font size. Okay, so these were the three properties that I wanted to show you in this video here. So flex direction, justify content, and align items. Because these three are by far the most used Flexbox properties on the Flex container. Now there are also flex wrap and align content, but I'm gonna leave these for another video. Now, before we finish this one, I wanna show you what happens with the justify content and align items when we change the flex direction. Okay, so let's set this one to a column. All right, and now the main direction is no longer going from the left to the right, but from the top to the bottom, right? And so why are these items now here horizontally centered like this? Do you know why? Well, it's because of this align items property set to center, right? Because this direction here now, so basically the horizontal centering is now in the cross direction. And remember that align items is the property that controls the positioning along the cross axis. And so this center here is responsible for that. So let's set it to flex start. And so now we see that it's at the beginning of the cross axis, which remember now goes from left to right. So it starts here and it ends here. And so if we set it to flex end, then all of these move to the right side, right? And so once again, it's really important to keep track of where the main and the cross axis are situated in order to use the justify content and align items properties in the correct way. Okay? And now just to show you how the justify content works in this situation, let's just increase the height of this container. Okay? To, I don't know, like me experiment here a bit. 500 pixels, for example. No, that's not enough. So 1000 pixels even. Or maybe it should be even more, I guess. So 1500 pixels. Okay, and now let's see what happens here. So you see that they now start here, and then they're basically centered now in the container, right? So this space here, down here at the end of the container, is the same as this space here up here, right? And once again, why is that? Well, it's because justify content is set to center. And so along the main axis, which is now going from top to the bottom, right? So along this main axis, they are now centered. So let's change it to space between. And so this is what happens. So the space is now distributed here between these items, just as I showed you before. But when I showed it to you the first time, it was horizontally. So it was in this direction, but now as we change it to a column, it now happens in the vertical direction. Because once again, that is now the main axis. All right, and I think that was enough experimentation for one lecture alone. And I know that it's probably very confusing right now, because I felt the exact same thing when I first started learning Flexbox. It was all very confusing in my head and so many properties with so many different names. But believe me that after some time using these, you will really know how to use them and when to use which property, and it will all become really easy for you, okay? So don't worry if it sounds confusing right now, because with practice, it becomes really easy and intuitive, okay? And in the next lecture, we're gonna take care of the properties related to the flex items themselves, okay? So we're gonna change some order and experiment with the flex grow, shrink, and flex basis properties, okay? So keep tuned for that next lecture. After the Flexbox properties for the Flex container, now I want to show you the properties that we use directly on the Flex items. So this is where we left off after the last lecture. Now let me just put this one here so it aligns item back to center. Okay, because now the first thing that I want to show you is the align self property. Okay, so we can come here to one of these items and then use align self. And remember what align self does? Well, basically it overrides the align contents property for one individual item. So right now the align items is set to center, okay? And so all these items here are now centered along the cross axis, right? So from top to bottom. But if we want to override that for one individual, let's say the number 4 here, we can say align self and put this one, for example, at the end. So flex end. And so now all the flex items except this one here are aligned to the center, so along the cross axis here, except for this one, which we set to flex end. And we can set it to flex start, of course. We can also set it to stretch, and that one is pretty useful. And we're going to see that one in the course. And so now this one is actually the same height as this one, because it's stretched in order to fill the entire container, which was defined by this element with the number 2. And so now the number 4 here has the same height. Okay, so let's just put it back to the end here. So flex end. All right, so that's the first one that I want to show you. And next we can play around with the order. So remember that the initial value of order is 0. And so if you want to put one of these elements here at the beginning, all we need to do is to put a value which is lower than 0. So let me show you how. So order -1. And now it will go here to the start. And so why is that? Well, Flexbox orders all of these elements according to their order number. And so this one has 0, 0, 0, and 0. So all of these have 0, but this one has -1. And so this is the one that has the lowest order. And since Flexbox starts ordering from the lowest order number, well, then of course this one here becomes the first, right? Now if you want to change this, and let's put another class here for the third one. So i3, if you want this one here to be the first one, then we can set this order to -2, for example. And now this one will be the one with the lowest order. And so it now comes here to the first position. Now we can also do this the other way around. So if we set this one to 1, then it's the one with the highest order. And so it moves here to the end. And so now we have -1, 0, 0, 0, 1. And we can use this even further if we wanted. So for example here order 2, and now this one would be the last, right? So that's how we use order. And that's actually pretty useful once more for responsive design in order to change position for some elements on a smaller or on a bigger screen, depending if we're using a mobile first or a desktop first strategy. Alright, so that's order and align self. Now let's take a look at the last three, which are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So the first one that I want to show you is flex grow. And remember that flex grow is the ability of an element to grow. Okay? And what we do is to specify an integer. So just a number like we did in the order. So the first thing I want to do is to actually set flex on all the items, right? And so for that I can use here the item class. So flex grow 1, and take a look what happens now. Alright, so all of them now occupy the entire space that they can. Or in other words, they grow it as much as they can. So they're now occupying all the space they possibly can, right? And we can see that even better if we remove this margin here actually. Okay, and so now they're actually touching one another because again, they occupy all the space that they can. And that's what flex grow here does. Okay, so it gives items the ability to grow. Now if we set all of them to a higher number like 2 or 3, or even 23, it doesn't really matter because this number only matters in relation to other numbers. So let me actually give you an example of that. Okay, so I'm gonna set these back to 1, put this margin here back as well. But now what I'm gonna do with this one here is to set flex grow to 2, and watch what happens now. You saw that? This element here is now double the size of these ones. And that's because 2 is double of 1. And so this one has twice the ability to grow than all the other flex items. And I can show you that even better by setting this, for example, to 3. And now it's 3 times bigger than the others. So flex grow, again, gives the element an ability to grow. Now remember that there's also a shorthand property which stands for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And so saying flex grow is actually the same thing as saying flex 1, okay? So a simple trick to expand a flex item to occupy as much width as it can is simply setting its flex property to 1, okay? Let me get rid of this now. And this one here as well. So let me show you what happens if I just set this on one of them. Let's say this one here, the last one. So flex 1. All right, and so now this one occupies all the space that it can, so all the available white space, and then the remaining flex items here, they just occupy the rest of the space. Okay, so that is flex grow. Now next up, I want to show you flex basis. Let's do it on this one here. Actually, and I can actually get rid of this one here. So flex basis, and now remember that with this one, we can set the width of a flex item. Okay, so instead of using the width property on a flex item, we usually use flex basis, right? So let's set it to 20%, for example, and here we go. So it's now 20% of the container. Then these other elements here, which basically have their flex basis set to auto, which is the initial value for flex basis. Okay, so this one here simply occupied the space that they need, and then all the remaining space is occupied by this last element here, because it flex set to 1. Okay, and now the one that's missing is flex shrink, okay? And in order to better show that to you, let's actually change this one here to a pixel-based value, okay? So let's say 300 pixels. Okay, and so now this one here has 300 pixels. Now take a look at what happens when I decrease the viewport width, okay? So just decreasing this window here. So you saw what happens? So again, the first thing of course that happens is that this element here grows smaller and smaller. That's because it has less and less space which it can occupy, and so of course it becomes smaller, right? Now as I further decrease this here, what starts to happen now? Well, you see that this element here also decreases, right? So even if we set its flex spaces to 300 pixels, so basically we set the width to 300 pixels, it still starts decreasing when there's no more available space, okay? But sometimes that's not exactly what we want, okay? So we can actually change that using the flex shrink property, because remember, flex shrink controls how an element can shrink. So flex shrink. Now remember that flex shrink has the initial value of 1, okay? And so 1 means that the element is basically allowed to shrink, okay? And that's why we see this behavior here, where the element starts getting smaller and smaller as there's no more available space. Now if we don't want this to happen, we simply set it to 0. And with that, the element is no longer allowed to shrink. So let's see that. And you see what happens now? These last elements simply get clipped basically from the viewport. Or actually the viewport increases its width in order to fit these remaining elements. But what doesn't happen is that this element doesn't change its width because it's not allowed to shrink, okay? And so that's what we did here with flex shrink to 0. All right? Now, as I mentioned before, we should always use the flex property, okay? And so instead of having this, we just use the shorthand because that's the best practice. So flex, and now it's 0 for flex grow, right? Because we don't want this element to grow as much as it can, so occupying all the space it can. Then we also don't want it to shrink, and we want a flex spaces of 300 pixels, for example. And so that's exactly the thing that we had before. Okay, let's convert this one here as well. Well, where is it? Oh, it's not here anymore. Okay, so I already deleted. But what we usually want here is actually the 1. So usually we want the elements to be able to shrink, right? Because we don't want that situation where the elements no longer fit the container. Okay, and so that's the way it works now. And so with that, I showed you all of the properties that we can apply to a flex item. Now there's a lot more to learn, of course, and again, we're going to use all of this later in the project. And by then, you can see how we actually use all of these properties in real life situations. So this here is just a very small example, just to really show you how the properties work and that they exist. But as soon as we start the project, you will use these properties in the real life and everything will make a lot more sense to you. Just before we finish this basic intro to Flexbox part, I want to quickly show you what happens when we have a whole lot of flex items in a flex container. So right now we have these 5 elements, but what happens if we just add another 5 of these? Okay, so let's get rid of these class names here, of course. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so you see that all of these flex items, they are now getting crammed here into this line. And if we decrease this even more, then there's even less and less space available. And at some point they even start overflowing the flex container like this, like we saw before actually. But as you know, there's another property that we can use on the flex container, right? And that is called flex wrap. So flex wrap, and its initial value is no wrap. And that's because it's not wrapping into a new line. But if we say wrap like this, then it will create a new line for these flex items that no longer fit the container. And so that's actually happening already. So you see that this item here with the 3, so this I3 here, which has this flex set to 1, has now an entire new row for itself. And if we actually decrease this even more, then you see that more and more elements come down here to the second row, so basically the second line that is created here as the flex items start to wrap. Okay? And once more, this can be pretty useful for responsive design when we get less and less space to work with in our layouts, right? Now let's again get rid of these huge margins that we have here. So I'm going to put 5 pixels here just so that we have a little bit of margin. And so that's what it looks like. Now, let me actually increase the container here, okay? So you see that right now the container ends here, of course, and that makes sense. But for what I want to show you next, we need a higher container. So let's increase it. Well, not that much, probably. So let's actually, like, I don't know, maybe 1000 pixels. And so let's see what it looks like this. So with all this space, this creates a bunch of different lines here. And actually, I'm not sure about this one here. Let's reload it. Or first save this actually, and then reload it. And it still does that. Okay, that looks a bit weird here. It looks like it should be in here. Let's check that one out. And yeah, of course, it is just because it's set here to flex end here, okay? So that's the only reason why it's down here. It's actually on the same row as this one. So let's just change this one here, or simply get rid of it. So that's the same effect. So what happens here is that we have 2 rows, basically. So first this one, and then this one. Now, why is all of this space here between these rows? So this one and this one. Well, that's because of the align content property that I didn't show you yet. And so I'm going to show it to you right now. And that's one of these that's once again set here on the flex container. So align content, and let's set it to flex start. Okay, and so now all of these rows move up. Okay, and that is because what the align content property does is that it aligns the rows along the cross axis. So it's pretty similar to align items, with the difference that align items aligns the flex items, as the name actually says, and align content aligns entire, let's say, rows along the cross axis, right? And so now, as we set flex start here, both these rows are now here at the beginning, and then all of the space down here is empty, right? Now we can also set it to flex end, just to demonstrate you that. And so both rows basically move down here, okay? Let me decrease this a bit here so that the last row doesn't have only this one element, okay? And so let's actually try another one here. So center, which is also pretty useful. And so now, as you can guess, the space here, up here, is the same as the one down here, because these 2 rows are now centered inside the flex container along the cross axis. So basically vertically, right? Now this is a bit difficult to visualize here because we don't have a lot of space here, okay? We just increase this a little bit more, okay? Now there's also space around, just as we have in justify content. So it's the same logic. And this is what it looks like. So basically it distributes the space between the rows so that the space on the bottom and on top of each of the rows is the same. Okay, so just like with justify content. Then we also have space between, which will push one of the lines to the top of the element and the other one to the bottom. Okay, and then finally stretch, which is actually the default, so the initial value. Now the stretch here doesn't really stretch all of these elements like it does in align items, okay? It just stretches the rows, which is not really visible. So this is pretty similar to like space between, okay? So align content is the last property that I wanted to show you. And again, it controls how the rows are aligned along the cross axis, similar to align items. And that is actually it. So that's all I had to show you here in this very basic introduction about Flexbox. So now you know the very fundamentals of Flexbox so that you are ready to move on to the project that we're about to start in the next lecture. So, are you excited about that? Then don't wait and join me right in the next lecture. See you there. So, welcome to our second project in this course. And without further ado, let me actually show it to you. And so here it is. This project is called Trello, and it is a fictional all-in-one booking app. Okay, so the idea is that a user can book a hotel, a flight, a car, and a tour all in one platform. Now, of course, we're not going to build this app itself, so no functionality, but we're going to code this user interface here. So all of this app that you see here. So here in this navigation, you can see that we're right now browsing the hotel section. And so here on this side, you have an hotel overview. So some pictures, then the name, some stars here, and then an overview where you have a list with a couple of features. And then here on the right side, you have some reviews. Okay, then down here we have a section where we can book, and then you have this nice hover effect here on this button. Okay, and here you probably already saw here on the navigation, we also have this nice hover effect here going on. So this one here, and then here at the top we have like this header bar where you have the logo, then the search bar, and then basically here are bookmarks, some chat, and the name of the user. So that is our project. So the main focus, of course, is on Flexbox here. But you're also going to learn a couple of new stuff, like doing these cool animations here and how to use these icons, because these are actually SVG icons, and that's something really cool. And so I'm going to show you how to use these. And so in general, you're going to learn Flexbox, but also a couple of other different techniques that I'm going to show you. And once again, I tried to make this a really beautiful, really modern looking app, so that you not only learn how to code and not only learn Flexbox, but so that you also get some inspiration for building a beautiful web app, and also that you have some nice thing to show off after this course. And so I hope that you really like the look of this app, of this interface. I know that I really like it. Okay, I put a lot of work in this so that you can be proud of your work by the end of the project. So all we need in order to get started with this project is our starter files that you can download from the course if you didn't already, and then just open up that starter files in your code editor. So I already have the starter files here on my desktop. Okay, so this folder, and I also have it opened up already in VS Code. Okay, and so here it is. So that's the bare bones HTML structure, just like we had in our previous project, where all we have is the title here, so Trello, your all-in-one booking app, and then the font, which this time is Open Sans here, and then the style, which is already included in here. Now what we also have is a SASS folder, because once again we're going to use SASS here, okay, and then an empty SASS file where all we have is these color definitions here. So what I also have here is of course the images, so that's the one we're going to use. The CSS, but this is still empty because we're going to then compile our SASS file, and so that one is still empty. Then I also have this package.json file from our last project. And so let's actually now start by changing this one here. Okay, and to adapt it to our needs for this project. Because I don't want to write all of these scripts here over again. And so I just copied this file, and so we can use it here in this project as well, because it's actually really the same thing. Okay. So again, we have a main.scss file, which is going to compile to style.css. We want our dev server here, and we want the watch CSS to run together with the dev server. And so we have this start script here, right? Remember that one? So that is our development setup. And then down here, we also have the build process, which in fact is also exactly the same. And well, actually is not, because we don't have the icon fonts here, okay? So there's not really anything to concatenate. So let's take this one out. And then the input to this one here is style comp, right? So this build process here is a bit smaller than the one in the previous project. So we're going to compile the SASS code here, then prefix it here, then compress. And yeah, so our build process is these three. So the concat has to go, of course. So compile, prefix, and then compress. Okay, but we're going to talk about this later because we're only going to use this build process in the end of this project. Okay. Okay, so this is also different. So let's just say it's the Trello app. Okay, doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's actually open up the console here. And here I'm just going to write Trello just to see if everything is working. Okay. And so the terminal. So let me see what we have here. And so in my case, I have to navigate to the desktop and Trello. And so now this is my project folder, just to make sure it has the CSS, IMG, and SASS folders, and then index and package.json. Okay. So please do the same. Navigate to your project folder, just like I did. And then we can run npm run start, just like we did with our previous project. And something's not working, and of course it's not working because we actually have to first install our packages. Okay, and now remember what I told you in one of the first lectures where we talked about npm. So back then I told you that usually we only copy the package.json file, but we don't copy the node SASS folder, which is that folder which contains all of these packages here, right? So we never copy that folder and share it. Instead, we just install all the packages over again. So we say npm install. And so now it gets all of these packages and installs them in a new node modules folder. Okay, clear? And now we can write that command again. So npm run start. And yeah, here we go. So now it's really working, right? Let's just do some CSS here or some SASS. Like our global reset, we can say margin 0, padding 0. And then we can also say, and just to test, background color, and then set it to this background color, okay? Just to see if our SASS is working fine, okay? Okay, so it reloaded the page and it compiled our SASS code. And so everything is working. And so we're now ready to actually start building the project. So let's do exactly that right in the next lecture. Let's start our project by defining the basic project settings, just like we did in our previous project. And in order to do so, you will learn how and why to use custom properties in CSS instead of SASS variables. Now, before we start with the code itself, I want to first talk a bit about architecture here. So in this project, I don't want to worry so much about architecture. I'm not going to create all these folders and all these files like I showed you in the last project, okay? Because in the last project, I really wanted to focus on that and make it like an important feature of the project. But this time, all we want to do here is really to learn Flexbox, right? And so all I'm going to do here is to just create 3 very simple files, one for the base settings, one for the overall layout of the app, and one for our smaller components, okay? And that way we don't have to jump back and forth between all these different files and can focus more on the code. But this doesn't mean that architecture is not important, because it is. But again, the main focus of this project is just to learn Flexbox, okay? Let's now just create these files. So base.scss, then I'm going to create layout SCSS, and then finally components SCSS. All right. And then actually we can copy all of this stuff here into the base file and then import these 3 files into this one, right? Just as we did in the last project. So these 3 files here are our partials, and then we do 3 imports. So import base, and then I'm just going to copy this over. So base, layout, and components. Okay, so let's give this a save and take a look at our page here. And so everything is still working the same. And so our imports here work, and we have our very small and very simple architecture here all set up, okay? So we're not going to need the main file anymore, neither the component nor the layout files for now. All right, so let's now start with these basic project settings, okay? And I want to start with the HTML. And the first thing that I want to do is to set the box sizing. And I'm going to do it the exact same way as I did in the other project. So I set it to border box here in the HTML, and then I make everything inherit this property, okay? So the universal selector and also the after and the before pseudo elements. So all the elements as well as all the before and after pseudo elements should then inherit the box sizing property set to border box, okay? So box sizing inherit. All right, and with that we have our global like reset here set up. So the margin to 0, padding to 0, and all the elements inheriting the border box for box sizing. Now the other thing that I need to do, of course, is to set the global font size. And once more, we're going to set it to 62.5%. And remember why that is? Well, this is just so that 1 rem equals 10 pixels, okay? And so that makes it a lot easier for us to work with rems. And just as a reminder why it's 62.5%, that's just because 10 pixels, which is our target, so what we want, divided by 16 pixels, which is the browser default, results in 62.5%. Okay, so this is just a reminder for you in case you have forgotten how we reached this 62.5%, okay? So that is the HTML. Now we have the body here already, but this background color, of course, was just a test. And so what I really want to set here is the font family. So font family, and as I mentioned, this time we're going to use Open Sans, which once again is coming from Google Fonts. So you see that I already included it here, okay? So it's coming from Google Fonts, okay? Well, and if that one fails, so if for some reason the browser cannot load Open Sans from Google Font, then we simply tell the browser to use a sans serif font instead. Okay, so that's pretty standard. Now we also set the font weight to 400, and then the line height of the overall document to 1.6. All right, and now we also want that gradient that I showed you. So the color here is gone. Okay, and what we want for the background is basically this gradient going from this pink color here in the top left corner all the way to this darker pink here in the right bottom corner. Okay, so it's basically a gradient going from this side to this side. Oops, sorry, here to this corner with these two pink branding colors that we're using for this app. Okay, so these are the colors that we're going to use. But of course, we're not just going ahead and copy these colors down here to the gradient, but instead we're going to use variables, just like we did before with SASS variables. Now in this project, we are not going to use SASS variables because I want to show you something else, something new in CSS. And that is CSS custom properties, which are better known as CSS variables. So that means that we can actually right now use variables in CSS and don't have to rely on SASS variables. Now, maybe you're wondering what's wrong with SASS variables? Why would we use CSS custom properties or CSS variables? Well, the first thing is, of course, that with CSS variables, you don't even need a preprocessor. So if you're just using SASS for the variables, then you wouldn't need it anymore because CSS can now natively handle CSS variables. But that's of course not the only advantage of CSS variables. What's also really cool is that they can be manipulated in JavaScript, and we can also edit them in our DevTools. Also, it's easier to use CSS variables in the calc function, and also CSS variables cascade and they are inherited. So they are very different from SASS variables in that regard. Okay, so let's now actually use CSS variables or custom properties. Now these custom properties, they have to be defined inside a scope, and so within a declaration block. So just like something like this here, okay? So this is a declaration block, remember. Now we could put these variables just in any normal selector, like any selector that we want. But then these variables would only be available in that element and its children, okay? And that's of course not what we want. Also, it's easier to just have one central place where we collect all the variables in one place, right? And this one place is usually the root pseudo class. So let's write that out. So just like this. So this is the root pseudo class. And this is essentially like the same thing as the HTML selector, but with a higher specificity, okay? So by putting all our variables in here, they will be accessible throughout the entire document, because that's what the root of a document is. It's like the global parent element. And therefore, all the variables we're going to declare here will be available to all the child elements. And this is how we actually declare custom properties. We use double dash, so dash dash, and then the name of the property. So color primary. And now we can copy this part here. All right, and that's it. So you see that it actually works very similar to a normal CSS property, okay? So we have like margin 0, And up here we have our custom property, which is color primary, and then this part here. The only difference is that we use these dash dash in order to distinguish between our custom properties and the normal, like, built-in CSS properties. Okay, so let's define the other two primary colors as well. So color primary light, which is this one, and then color primary dark, which is this one. Alright, and now we have our custom CSS variables or custom properties. Okay, and so now let's actually go use these properties. And that's how it works. So remember, we want that gradient. So background image, linear gradient, then the direction, actually in here of course, to right bottom, and then the colors. And this is how we use them. We use the var function, and then in here we call our custom property. So color primary light is the first color, and then color primary dark. And that's it. And now just the background size, let's set it to cover. And now let's take a look at this. And here we go. Well, it looks a bit weird, but this is actually what we told it to do. Okay, so we set this linear gradient on the body, but right now the body is only really this element here. So this small text that we have here, okay? And so the height of the body is just these 16 pixels. Then from there, the background simply repeats down here. So this is simply the same background over and over again, but repeated. And that's actually the default in CSS. But we can remove that by writing background repeat and set it to no repeat. Okay, and now it should be gone. And here we go. So now the background is only really on the body element itself, just as we specified. Just for now, let's increase this body to cover the entire viewport height, okay? So 100 VH, but we're later gonna remove this one when our element becomes larger than 100 viewport height. Or actually we can do it differently. We can just say min height, okay? And then it happens exactly the way we want, okay? So the minimum height will be 100 VH, but if the height can be bigger than that, well then it will simply be bigger. So this 100 VH is not really like strictly enforced, okay? So let's take a look at that now. And here we go. So now it's covering the entire viewport height because we said that the body should be all of this, so 600 pixels in this case. And now the last thing that I want to define here is the overall text color, okay? So let's actually go up here and create some more variables with these. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and copy these here and then just put the dashes here. So I'm gonna use multiple cursors here. Dash dash gray light, and then the number here of course. Okay, and now just these ones. All right, so these are our primary colors. These are a couple of light gray colors, and then the darker gray colors. So this is here is the one that we're going to use for text. Okay, so gray dark 2. And actually let me add color here as well, just as we had here for the primary colors. Okay. All right. So color var color. Well, where are the other ones? I want gray dark 2, I think. Maybe something is wrong here. And yeah, actually it is. So we're missing the semicolons here at the end of the code, right? All right, so that's better now. So hopefully it works now. And yeah, here we go. So it's now this gray color here. Okay, and so these are our basic settings for this project. So we defined some custom CSS properties, which behave just like variables, right? Then we defined our global reset, like with this global box sizing set to border box, and we did our margin and padding set to 0. We defined our global font size so that 1 rem equals 10 pixels to make our life easier. And then we just set these font definitions here, and then our background gradient. Okay, so we're not going to need this file anymore. Let me just close it. And then in the next lecture, it's time to actually start building the overall layout of this project. So let's move on now. In this lecture, we will build the overall layout of our app. And so we will first discuss how to do that, and then use Flexbox for the first time in the real life to create a part of that layout. So looking at the final design of our app, what can we say about the overall layout of this interface? Well, first of all, there is this huge container here, so all of this which actually holds the entire app. Okay? And that container is then also nicely centered here in the viewport. So that's the first element of the layout. Then in this container, we first have this header part here, let's say, where we have the logo, the search bar, and then these user navigation items. Okay, so this here is the header. And then below that, we basically have two big parts. The first one I call the sidebar, which is this one here. So it has this navigation and it has this small legal text here, okay? And then on the right side, we have this hotel overview, which is how I like to call this. So a huge block which then contains all of this information about this hotel that we're currently watching. So these are the three big parts inside of the container. First the header here on top, then on the left side the sidebar, and then here on the right side the hotel view. Okay? So let's mark that up in HTML before we start writing the CSS for that. So let's start with the overall container, and I'm using a div element for that. And once again using emmet here. So container. So that's our container where all the content will be. Then in there we have, as I mentioned, the header. And for that one we're going to use the header element in HTML5, okay? So header with the class of header. Okay, so that's the top part. Let's actually write header in here. So the header part. And then remember that we have the sidebar and the hotel view. Now in order to position these two elements, we actually need a container for them, okay? And I'm going to call that one content. So I'm using a div again, and then content. So basically the content is like the entire part which is below the header. So it's the sidebar, for which I'm using the nav HTML5 element because it mainly holds our navigation, okay? And so I think nav is the best element to show that, to convey that meaning to the element, okay? So nav and then sidebar. So I'm writing navigation here just so we know what box is what, and then we have the hotel view. And this time I'm using the main HTML5 element because I think this is the perfect element because, as the name says, the main element is where the main part of a website or a web app goes. And in this case, that's clearly this hotel view. Okay, and so main is perfect here. So hotel view. And that is actually already our overall layout. Okay, so that's exactly what we have here. Header, then the content, which is all of this together, and then on the left side, the navigation, or the sidebar actually, how I called it, and then here on the right side, the hotel view. Okay? To our layout file here and start writing our code. So we have our container, we have our header, the content, sidebar, and finally hotel view. And let's start with our container. So the first thing I want to define is the width of this container. And I'm once again going to use max width here so that the container can decrease if there's not enough space to display our 120 rem, which is the width that we want for this container. Okay, so 1200 pixels basically if we have enough space, but if it's not enough space, so if the viewport is less than 1200 pixels, then we simply occupy 100% of that available viewport width. Okay, and that's what max width does. All right, then I also want to center it in the viewport. And I'm using our old trick here with margin. Okay, so top and bottom, let's actually put 8 rem here, so 80 pixels, and then the left and right side set to auto, as we did in the previous project as well. Okay, and so that centers the container inside of its parent element, which is the body in this case. Now we also want a background color in this container, and the one I'm going to use is color gray light 2. Okay, so this one, let me show it to you. So base, I'm actually going to leave it open here. So this is the gray color that I defined for the background. Okay, and then we also want a nice box shadow, and a really dark one actually. So 0 in the X direction, of course, then 2 rem, and now 6 rem, so really huge blur here, and then a 0.3 opacity. Okay, so let's actually take a look at that. Well, actually before we should maybe define a height here as well. So a max, or actually a min height. Okay, and so this is just for testing purposes once again. Okay, and so now we can take a look at the result, and here we go. Okay, let's close this one here. And so that looks pretty good already. So we have our nice shadow here, and we can see our 3 layout elements here as well. So header, navigation, and hotel view. So let's go back. And actually we can reuse this shadow maybe in the future. And so I want to show you that we cannot only use colors, we can use other stuff as well as variables. Okay, so let's add a new one here, simply called shadow dark. And then we can do it like this. So variables, of course, not only work for colors here, but we can store other things in there as well. So let me now just copy this, and then in here I can simply say var again, and then the name of the variable. So let's check that out, and you see it still works the same. Okay, and so now if we need it, we can reuse it later in the project. Okay, so now it's time for the header, and here once again I'm going to define a height, and this one will be 7 rem, so 70 pixels in height. I want it to have a background color, a white one, and this time I'm simply just going to write out FFF because I know that that means white, and then it should also have a border bottom. Okay, and actually the color that I want here is this light gray, and the one that I want here is the gray number 1. Okay, so these are just various subtle variations of the same light gray. So let me show that to you. Okay, and so here you see it. Okay, so next up, let's think about the navigation and the hotel view. So for the sidebar, we want a background color of this dark gray here. So the darkest color of all. So var and gray dark 1. And on the hotel view, we simply want a white background. So let's grab this one as well. And let's now take a look again. And all right, now of course we want these two to be side by side, right? So the navigation on the left side, in the hotel view on the right side. And what is the perfect tool for doing that? And I'm sure you guessed it, we're going to use Flexbox now. So in order to start Flexbox, all we need to do is to set the display property of the Flex container to Flex, right? So display Flex, and that's it. So this one here, of course, will be our Flex container, right? Because it's the one that holds the 2 elements we want side by side. So content will be our Flex container, and sidebar and hotel view will be our 2 Flex items. Okay, so just to see if this actually worked, let's take a look. And yeah, so actually they are side by side now, not occupying a lot of space, of course, but they are already side by side, and so that's a good starting point. Now let's set some properties on the individual items in order to make them look more like this here, okay? So the navigation should have a width, and I'm sure that you know how to do that, right? So the property that we use with Flexbox to define width is the Flex basis property. Now we should always use it in the shorthand Flex property, okay? So that's what we're going to do now. So Flex, then the first one is Flex grow, and we don't want the element to grow beside the width that we're going to define. We also don't want it to shrink, okay? Because remember that the second value here stands for flex shrink, so it's 0 as well. And then we want the flex basis, which is 18%. And that's it. So 18% is the number that I came up with, which is the perfect width for this sidebar. But you can experiment with other numbers here until it fits the perfect width for you. And so that's it. So once again, with flex, we said that we don't want the element to grow if there's some space. We also don't want it to shrink if there's not enough space, but we always want it to keep at 18%. And since it's a percent value here, it's actually okay to say that we don't want it to shrink, because it will automatically shrink because it's a percentage, right? So it's not like a pixel value. In that case, it would be better to allow it to shrink, but right now it's good like this, okay? So let's check it out. And all right, you see here that it has now this 18%. In the hotel view, well, it's still this very small. Let's actually give it a background color as well, a different one. So just to see it a bit better. So I'm sure you guessed it, it's orange red again. So you see that this element is still very small, which of course we don't want. We want it to occupy the entire remaining space, right? So using Flexbox terms, we want it to grow as much as it can. And what it means in code is to simply say flex 1. Okay, and that's it. So again, by using flex 1, what we say is that the element should grow as much as it can. So over all the available space that it has. And that's what happened here. So it now grew all the way until the right side and is occupying the remaining 82%, right? So 100 minus 18 is 82. And so that is the power of Flexbox. There's no floats, there is no clear fixes, there's no weird hacks like all that. Just very simple, just 3 lines of code actually. We just wrote this flex here, and the display to flex. So that was all we needed to create this small layout. Okay, and that's actually all I had to show you in this lecture. So the overall layout is now coded up, and we're ready to start building here the header. So that's what we're going to do right in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture and the next one, we're going to build the header part of the app. And that will include using SVG images as icons instead of an icon font. So you're going to learn what SVGs actually are, how to find, generate, and use SVG sprites in HTML, how to change the color of an SVG image in CSS, and finally, you will learn some more advanced Flexbox alignment techniques, which we're going to need to lay out all the components in the header. So in our header, we basically have 3 main components. We have the logo here, okay? Then we have this search bar with this input field here and this icon. And then on the right side, we have something that I call the user navigation. So we have like bookmarks, a chat functionality, and the name of the user. Okay, so these 3 are the main components: logo, search bar, and user navigation. So let's mark that up in our HTML right now. So header. And we start with the image, which I simply call logo. And the source for this one is in the img folder and simply called logo. And as a description, I just use Trello logo. All right, so that's the first part. Next, we have a search bar, and for that, I'm using a form element, okay? And the action is just the hash symbol, so nothing happens, okay? Now in here, we want an input, which is called search input. And as you see, once again, I'm using the BEM notation here, okay? So search is my block, and then the element is the input separated with these 2 underscores, okay? Now we also have the placeholder here, which says search hotels, okay? And then the button. And you can guess, this one is called search button. Now remember that in here, in the button, we actually had this little icon, this magnifying glass, so this icon here, right? So in the last Natures project that we built, and maybe in your projects that you've built for yourself, we've been using icon fonts, right? But this time we're going to do it differently, and we're going to use SVGs as icons, okay? Now, why are we actually moving away from icon fonts to SVGs? Well, there are several problems with icon fonts, like the fact that it's really just a hack to display icons which are like images using a font. Also, icon fonts fail more often than you would think, and in that case, the browser just displays a black square or something like that on the screen. And that's really terrible. And there are actually other issues, like screen readers for blind people trying to read out the icon fonts, and of course failing to do so. Alright? And because of all that, right now it's actually considered a best practice to move away from icon fonts and to move to a better alternative. And that better alternative is of course SVG. Now what is SVG actually? Well, SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and it's just basically a way of writing vector graphics with code. But don't worry, we're not gonna write any SVG code here for icons, okay? Instead, we're gonna use a great app called iCoMoon. And so let's open that one, iCoMoon.io. And so it's just really a simple web app, okay? So let's move here to here where it says iCoMoon app. So here in the iCoMoon app, you can upload an icon font if you want, for example here. So if you have an icon font on your computer and want to convert it to SVGs, then you can do it in here, okay? But what's even better is that we can just select some icons from their free library, okay? So let's do that. So if you come down here, you have add icons from the library. Then you have all of these free libraries with these free icons. Okay, so you can take a look at all of these. And the ones that I'm choosing are called InTypo. Okay, so InTypo Plus, because I really like these and I think they look great on our app. So we just hit add. And then from here, all we have to do is to select the icons that we actually want. Okay, and if we take a look at this finished app, we see that we actually need 10 icons. So these 4 icons here, then a star, then this bookmark, this chat, this location pin, this list item icon here, and then finally, of course, the magnifying glass, which is the one we're going to use next. Okay, so these 10 icons is the one that we need to select. And so here is one, here is the next one, then here is the plane, here is the chat, down here we have the house, and also the key down here. Let's see, the location. Then here the magnifying glass, the map, and finally the star down here. Okay, so we have our 10 icons selected. You can see it here, we have 10, okay? Now if you wanted other icons or more icons, you could of course select as many as you wished, okay? So all we have to do now is to come here, generate SVG and more, and then we see our 10 icons that we selected. Then we hit here the settings. Okay, so we see that there will be a class prefix called icon. And we don't want any PNGs. We just want SVGs. Okay, so it says SVG here now, and now we can hit download and open it up. So when you open this folder, it gives you all this stuff here, which you really don't use, okay? So all we need are these SVG files here, and even more importantly, this file here. So symbol devs. And this is a so-called sprite file. So what is a sprite file? Well, it's simply an SVG file which contains all of these 10 SVG images in it. Okay, and so that's the one that we're actually going to use, because this way we only have to use one global file, which is this one here. And from there we can select each of the icons. And so this way we only have one HTTP request for one file instead of having to include all of these 10 different files. So icon sprites like this one here is the way to go, and that's how all professionals do it, okay? Also we have this HTML file here, which is just so that we can see the names of the icons. And actually this is not the right one. The one that we need is just demo. So these are the names of the icons that we can then use in HTML. So first let's get our icons here. So this entire folder and then this one here. And I'm going to copy it to the project folder. So Trello, IMG, and then I'm pasting it in here. All right, here we go. Now I'm going to call this one sprite, And actually I already have one sprite because I included it here because I already had it, okay? So I'm going to delete it and call this one sprite. So you should also delete the sprite file that you already had and then change this one here to sprite. And so that's the one that we're going to use. I'm also leaving this folder here with these initial files because we're going to need maybe one of them later, okay? So, and with this, we are ready to use this sprite SVG file. So let's go back to our code editor here and include it. Now, how do we actually do that in HTML? Well, we use the SVG element, which I'm going to call search icon. And then in here, we have to use something called use, okay? So use, and then an attribute called xlink href. So that sounds a bit strange, but that's just how we can include the SVG file and then reference each separate icon in there, okay? So img sprite.svg, and that's the name of the sprite file. And now from here, we have to select the icon that we want. So let's see how it's called. And it's called icon magnifying glass. Let's copy that. And now we use hash and then the name of the icon. And that's actually it. So closing it, and here we go. So this is really the best way to include SVGs in HTML using a SVG sprite like we did. And that's because this way we can actually change the color of each of the icons using CSS. And I'm going to show you how in a little bit. Okay? Now another thing that I need to tell you is that using SVGs like this with the xlink href attribute is only going to work on a web server. So only on a web server you will be able to see this sprite SVG file. But since we're doing that actually, okay, we are using a web server, which is this local one here. So this localhost server, and that's why it actually works. And so here is our SVG icon, right? So everything works perfectly, and we're now ready to start using SVGs in our HTML. And that's a great step. Now this is of course not formatted here at all, but we're going to take care of that later. And another advantage actually of SVG is that it makes it really easy to format these icons. With icon font, it was always really hard to put them exactly the way we wanted. But with SVGs, that problem is gone, and it's actually super easy. Okay, and now finally, the user navigation. So we're using the nav HTML5 element here for the navigation. And then in here, I'm going to put 3 boxes. So let me show that to you. So 1 box for each of these. This box, and this box. Okay, so let's do that. So user nav, the name of the block, nav icon, and then in here our SVG. Now actually this is not the name that I wanted here. Let me change that. So icon box. So now it's okay. So this is a box where the icon will sit. And this one is the user nav icon. And now let's use the use again. So xlink href and img sprite. And this time let's check it out. We will want to use the, here it is. Let's close the icon moon. So we want the one called icon bookmark, and then next the one called icon chat. So icon bookmark, and next time the icon chat. Let's actually copy that already. Okay, so icon chat. Give it some space here. All right. And actually we also want like this notification indicator here, right? So this small notification circle here, okay? So that's just a span element, which I'm calling user nav notification. And here let's put a 7, and then in the other one, let's put 13. Okay, and now the next box, user nav, and this one I'm calling simply the user. So if you have an image here, as you remember, And this one is called, I think it's the one just called user. And that's actually a picture of myself. So user photo, and then just a span for the name. So user nav, username, and then my name in here. And that is our HTML markup for the header. So let's check it out now. And that's of course terrible at this point. So let's try to do some quick formatting here, especially of the images and icons, which are now like really huge. Okay, so we should fix that. So let's now open our components file here, because from now on, I'm going to write all the code for all these smaller components right here into this file. Now this stuff that we're going to put here, these are not really components in the meaning that I gave them in the last project. So they're not necessarily really reusable across projects, but I'm still calling them simply components here because that's the easiest way to do it here right now. Okay, so this one is simply called logo. And what I want here is a height of 3.25 rem. Okay, so remember once again that this project is not really about CSS architecture and all that stuff that I showed you in the last project, because these are really important. But in this project, I just want to focus on Flexbox and on building this app. All right, so that is the logo. And let me actually put a comment here on each of these so-called components. So just a line of these slashes here to separate them. And then I simply say logo. Okay. And now I do the same thing for the search box. And down here the same thing for the user nav. So search, and in here we have the input. And of course it's 2 underscores. And the button, of course. Let's see if we have something else here. So we have input, button. Oh, and here is icon as well. So, all right, icon. And now for the user navigation, let's also put these selectors here already. So user nav, and here we have the icon box. And let's see what else we have. So icon box, then we have icon here, notification, user, user photo, and username. So there's a lot of stuff to select here. So icon box, icon, we have the notification, the user photo, and finally the user name. So that's a lot to format here. But what I want to start with for now is these huge parts, okay? So we already gave the icon here a smaller size, but we want to do the same with this magnifying glass and with these two icons, and of course with this user image here, okay? So let's do that right now. So let's start with the search icon here. Now, how do we actually format an SVG icon? Well, it's really easy compared to icon fonts. All we have to do is to set its height and its width in order to size it the way we want. So let's set to rem for both the height and the width. Check it out. And here we go. And now it's really small. And now here for the user nav icons as well. And these here should be slightly bigger. So I'm putting 2.25 rem for both the height and the width. 2.25 rem. And now finally, the user photo. Let's give it a height of 3.75 rem. Okay? And since we're at it, I'll also make it a round, so border radius of 50%. And then let's see how it looks like right now. That looks better, but still far from perfect. So in the next lecture, we're going to take care of actually aligning all of these items properly using, of course, Flexbox, and then to style everything so that it looks great, just like this here. Okay, so that's what we're going to take care in the next lecture. See you then. This is part 2 of building the app's header section. So to start this lecture, let's actually put these 3 elements that we have here in the header side by side. And how do we do that? Well, you guessed it, we're going to use Flexbox. So what should be the Flex container here in this case? Well, it should simply be the parent element of the elements that we want side by side. And that's these 3 here. So the logo, the search bar, and the user navigation, right? And so the parent of these is the header element. So here we go. Yeah, so in the header. So all we have to do is to set display to flex, and that will put them side by side. All right, now let's give them actually some background color so that we can see what's going on here. So the search, I'm going to use my orange red favorite here again. And then on this one here, we can use like green, yellow. All right, check it out. So, here we go. Now, how do we want these to be aligned? We want this green one here, so the user navigation, all the way to the right side, right? And then this one here in the middle. And what is the Flexbox property that allows us to do that? I hope that you printed your cheat sheet so that you can take a look at it and find out which property we have to use. Okay? And in case you don't know, we need to use justify content. And of course, that one is again on the Flex container, not on the Flex items. Okay? So justify content will align the elements along the main axis. And that's the one we're talking about here, right? So what are the possible values here? For example, we could use center just to show it to you. And that's what that would do. So it would simply center all of these elements side by side here in the center of the Flex container. But that's also not what we want, because what we really want is space between. Okay, and so it will basically divide the empty space between these 3 elements. And that's what that looks like, and it's perfect. That's exactly what we want. We could also do like space around. Let me show that to you as well. It would result in this one, but that puts way too much space here on the left side of this one and here on the right side. So we don't want that. We only want a little space, and so we're going to do that later with margins. But for now, in here, let's do space between. And I think that this one is actually the most useful one of all. All right. So that is alignment along the main axis, so from left to right. But we also want to align these items along the cross axis, right? So basically here from top to bottom, so that, for example, we can have this image here nicely centered vertically in the header. So if we didn't have Flexbox, we could now use like margin top and would then have to experiment which is the perfect margin. But Flexbox makes our lives so much easier, and all we have to do is to use the align items property, right? So remember that one? So align items and simply set it to center. And that's what it will produce. So this one is now nicely centered vertically, so along the cross axis, and so is this one and this one. This one is of course overlapping it because there's too much content in it, but still it is now centered. So you saw that before it was set to stretch, and that's why this element here was occupying the entire space, so everything here was orange, right? But now we set it to center, and so it's vertically centered now. So that is align items. So all we have to really do now is to just format these elements here, okay? So let's start with our logo and simply give it some margin to the left side of 3 rem, okay? And so now that's perfect, so really nicely positioned here. So starting here with the search element, let's first give it some width, okay? And since it's a flex item, let's do that using the flex property. So flex, We don't want it to grow to fill all its available space, okay? We also don't want it to shrink, and we want it to occupy 40% of the header, okay? Now, as for the input element, this is how we want it to look like, okay? So it's this gray rounded element here with this gray icon here at the end, okay? So let's now do that. And so we start with the font family, which on an input element doesn't inherit the font family of the global document. And so we have to automatically set it to inherit here. And the same thing for the font size, actually. So let's set it to inherit here as well. And then we want the background color. And again, we're going to use our variables here. And the one that we want right now is this gray color here, okay? So light gray 2. We want it to have no border. We also want the text color to be inherited. Okay, so we set all of these here in the same place. Well, what else can we do? We can set some padding. So 0.7 rem on the top and bottom, and 2 rem on the left and on the right side. So 20 pixels. Now we also can set that border radius to a really high number. Doesn't matter. Can even set it in pixels. It doesn't really matter. Just a high number so that it has these rounded edges. And okay, let's take a look actually. And that's what it looks like. Well, still not perfect, but we're kind of getting there. We have to actually give it a width here. Okay. And we're not doing 100% because we want this to happen when we click it. You saw that? So it expanded when it received the focus. And when we click outside, it goes back to the original size. So let's set it to like 90%. Okay, and then we can also change what we want to happen when we focus the element. So focus, we don't want that outline, okay? But instead what we want to happen is that the width should be set to 100%. So that was the effect that we saw earlier. So when the input element becomes focused, it increases from 90% to 100% of its available width, which is this 40% here of the parent element. And we also want it to become a little bit darker, which is basically the same thing as this, but the light number 3. So that's a bit darker. And for the animation here, transition all in 0.2 seconds. So let's take a look at that now. And that's much better. So when we click it, it increases to 100%. Great. Well, it's still not perfect, but for now, let's continue with styling this button here now, okay? So here we are, the button. So first, we don't want any border on it. And then we want it to have the same background color as the input, because we basically want it to be like on top of the input, right? And actually, in order for that to happen, we should give the input here some negative margin on the right side. So margin right, and then like minus 3.5 rem. And so this way, the button will move on top of the input. Okay, now let's also just remove the focus here from this one. So outline, none. But what happens instead is that basically when we click the button, we just want it to move a bit down. So transform, translate Y, and then let's just say 2 pixels. All right, let's take a look now. And that's much better. So now it's actually on top of the search bar. And when we click this, we see this nice animation going on. Now what's left to do here is to actually center this icon here vertically as well as horizontally, right? Because when the input field is not active, we want it to be at the center of this element here, right? So of the parent element. So how do we do that? Well, the best solution is once again to use Flexbox. And so you see each time we want to center something or to align something, we can always use Flexbox. So Flexbox is perfect for all of these small situations where we need to align or center some elements. So what should actually be the flex container of these elements? Well, of course, it's the search element, right? And so now, for the first time, we're doing something that we didn't do before, which is that a flex item is becoming a flex container. And that is perfectly possible. So we now have nested flexbox. Okay. So again, let's take a look. And it's already centered, you see, because align items is set to stretch. So align items, let's move it from stretch to center, and then justify content also to center. So again, align items to center centers the elements along the cross axis, and justify content center centers the elements along the main axis. So let's check that out. And yep, that is exactly what we wanted, right? So now I hit this, and now it grows to the sides. So that's perfect. Now this margin here is not perfect here actually, but that's because of the negative margin that I gave it here on the other side, which is actually a bit too much. So it was here. And actually another thing that we have to do is to set the background color of the button to the same color of this focused here when the input is focused, right? So right now, if you look closely, you will see that if the input is selected, the background color here of this icon is slightly lighter, okay? So let's fix that. And we have to actually do it outside here. So input, focus, and then select the adjacent search button, right? So we did that a lot of time in the other project. So just to remember, here we have the input and here we have the button, and they are siblings, okay? And so therefore we can use the adjacent selector to select the sibling of the selected input, okay? So here in the components, and now what we want to happen is that the button becomes the same background color as the input, okay? And so now it should be perfect. All right, now one last thing is the color of this magnifying glass. Remember that I told you that with the way that we included the SVG sprite in the HTML, we could change the SVG color right in CSS, right? So let me now show you how we can do that. And it's actually very easy. All we have to do is to use the fill property. So fill, and that's it. And now we can specify our color. And the one that I want is this dark gray here, the number 3. And that's actually it. Let's just remove here this background color. And then this component will be completely ready. Okay, let's just compare it to this one. Well, this is actually a bit different because the text is bigger here and lighter. And so we should change that as well. So basically the placeholder here has a lighter text. Then when we start typing, it becomes the dark text that we have in our example, right? So what we have to do here is to change the placeholder text. So let's do that. So input, and then remember what we want is the WebKit input placeholder pseudo element. So WebKit input placeholder, meaning that this only works in WebKit right now, which are the Chrome and Safari browsers. So we want a font weight of 100 only and a color of a light gray 4. Okay, and now just remember that we put the font size here to inherit. And so it inherits the global font size, which is 10 pixels, remember, so 1 rem. But that's quite small actually. And so let's set a default font size here on the header. Okay, so let's go to the header and set a font size here. And then it will inherit the font size from this parent component. So let's set it to 14 pixels here, so 1.4 rem, and then check it out again. And yeah, that's much better. Now that looks a lot like or original, right? So this one here. So that was some great progress. You used a lot more Flexbox in this lecture to align these smaller elements here in this component and also overall in this header here, right? So Flexbox is perfect for these small kind of situations where you have to do some simple alignments. So instead of messing with margins and translates and floats and text align center and all of that stuff, we just use Flexbox and it's perfect for that. Now next up, we need to fix this user navigation here, of course, but I'm leaving that to the next lecture so that you can take a break right now and then come back to the next lecture once you're ready to go. All right, let's now finish the header in this third part. So we formatted the logo, we formatted the search bar. Now it's time to format the user navigation. And the first thing we have to do is to put these three elements, so this one, and this one here, all side by side. And so what's better than using Flexbox for that, right? So down here we have the user navigation. And so we're going to set display to flex to turn this into a flex container. And so once again, we have the situation that we had with the search bar before, where a flex item is also at the same time a flex container. And that is completely normal. It's no problem to do that. And it's actually pretty common, as you will see throughout the rest of the project. We're going to do that all the time. So display flex, and this is what it looks like. Now the next step is to vertically center these elements here, right? So along the cross axis. And so we use align items, set to center. And so that's what we get, and that's much better. So what can we do next? Well, let's take a look at this here. And so the next thing that I want to do is to apply the spacing here. Oh, what's going on here? Let's reload it. Ah, right. So the next thing that I want to do is to give it this spacing here between these boxes, and then also this gray background color on hover, right? So let's very quickly implement that. So where we want this space to happen is basically on the user nav icon box and this one and the user. Okay, so these two classes. Now we could go ahead and group them, so make a selector for icon box and user at the same time, but I'm simply going to do it like this. So the user nav and then all of the direct children. And that will have the exact same effect, right? Because we only select the direct children, which is what that selector here does. So all we do is to select this element, and this one. And that's exactly what I was saying before, right? So first some padding, and we want 0 on the top and 2 on the left and right, so 2 rem. And we want it to have a cursor in the form of a pointer. So I don't know if you saw that in the demo. And now let's take care of that background. So we select all of them again, but this time on hover. And what we want to happen is the background color set to our gray light 2 color. So let's copy that from here because it's a lot of code to type out. So this one here. Now this is not going to work as expected, but I'm going to show it to you why. So this is the gray hover for this icon box, and then for the user. So the height of this entire navigation bar here is given by the height of this element here, right? But that's not really what we want. We want this navbar to fill this entire space all the way from the beginning of the header to the end. So how can we actually achieve that? And there's one great Flexbox property for that, which I showed you before, and it's called align self, okay? So this is like align items, but for one individual flex item, right? So align self, and we want this one set to stretch. Okay, so remember that in the header here, we set the align items to center. And that's why the 3 elements, the logo, the search bar, and the user nav, are vertically centered. But in fact, we don't want the navbar to be vertically centered. And so we override the align items here with align self, setting it to stretch, which will then produce this result. Okay, and so that's much better. Now all we have to do to fix the fact that this hovering here is not going all the way from the top to the bottom is to then set the height of all of these elements to 100%. So let's check it out now. And so here we go. Now it's hovering the entire area. Okay, and so that is the power of align self. Now what's happening here, of course, is that this icon and this text is all the way at the top of its parent element. That's completely normal. but we should fix that. It should obviously be centered here vertically, right? And I'm sure that by now you can guess how we're gonna do that. So, Flexbox to the rescue. So let's go to the icon box, display, flex, and then align items, set to center. So once more, remember that align items aligns the flex items along the cross axis, and so usually vertically, and that's exactly what we want. So we want to center it vertically, so we use align items. And so now you see that we are already at the third level of flex containers, right? So that actually works. So the header is a flex container, then the navbar here, all of this element is a flex container, and now the icon box itself is a flex container as well. So we're already at the third level of flex containers. And once more, that's no problem, that is absolutely okay. That is just how Flexbox works, really. And actually, since we're doing this, we should actually do the same thing here with the user, right? So all of this should also be vertically centered. And so instead of putting it here in the icon box where we put it, we can actually put it here so that we do it to all of the direct children. So the two icon boxes as well as the user. Okay, and so that is much better. So all of these three are now effectively flex containers as well. All right, so let's now take care of these icons here. So changing the color and then formatting the notification here as well. So as for the icon, we already have its height and its width. Now let's also take care of the color of the icon. So once again, let's use the fill property, setting it to a dark gray. So the same one as well. Where is it? Actually, it's not here anywhere. So let's just copy this here and then change it. So color gray dark 2. Okay, so that's this one. So 777. So that's the color. And now let's format the notification here. So it should have a font size of 0.8 rem, so really small, then a height of 1.75 and a width as well of 0.75 rem, so 0.75, and here the same, and then a border radius set to 50%, and actually here it's 1.75, so such as I had it in the beginning. So 1.75 rem. Then the background color should be our primary pink color. So that's our primary color. And then the text in there should be white. And so I'm just going to use FFF here again. And so let's take a look at that. And that looks pretty good already. Now we have to actually position this element here on top of the icon, right? And so the best way of that is this time not using Flexbox. So Flexbox doesn't really give us a way to perfectly position an element exactly where we want it, but instead we're just going to use absolute positioning here, okay? So let's do that. So position absolute, and then remember the parent element should be set to position relative. So position relative here. And now let's say we want it on the top like 0 and from the right like 1 rem, just to experiment with this. And somehow it's gone. I see it's up here now and I'm not really sure why that is. So I guess maybe it's best to remove this position relative from here and put it here. So maybe it doesn't work that well on an SVG element, which the icon is in fact. And so let's just put it on the icon box. And so yeah, that works much better. Now we just have to move it down a little bit. So top like 1.5 rem. All right, here we go. Now just maybe a bit more to the left side. So increase it here, so 1.1 rem, but that should be perfect already. Now let's just get rid of this background color here. It looks kind of silly by now. And yeah, so that's great. Now all we have to do is to like center this text in here. both horizontally and vertically. And so let me tell you another secret, let's say, which is that we can actually use Flexbox for that as well. So Flexbox doesn't only work when we have child elements, but it works with text as well. So display flex. And now we simply have to say justify content center, which centers the content horizontally, and align items also to center, which is gonna center it vertically. So let's take a look at that. And in fact, you see that it works. So in this case, you actually have now 4 levels of Flexbox, one inside of another. Now what you see here maybe is that this is not really a circle here. And I think that's because this text here is larger than this one. You see this one is like a perfect circle, but this one is not. So I think we shouldn't use a border radius 50% here, but instead just like a very high number. So just as we did before here on this part. And actually it looks the exact same way, but never mind. This is really not a problem, all right? Now all we have to do is give it some space here on this user photo, and then I think we are good to go. So the user photo, margin left, and let's say 1 rem. And actually we don't really need to format this user here because we already did it up here with this selector where we selected all of the elements at once. And the username also doesn't really need to be selected because there's no style applying to it. Okay, let's actually set this here back to 50% because that's a cleaner solution. And so with that, I think that this is ready. Well, something here is not right. And yeah, of course it's not margin left, it's margin right. Okay, now this here looks like it has a lot more space here on this side than it has here. So it's not really symmetric. So let's change that one very quickly. So to 2 rem. And okay. So our hover here is also working. Let's compare it with this one here. And you see it actually is exactly the same. And so it's perfect. All right, so I hope that these first couple of lectures were really helpful for you to start grasping the concepts that are behind Flexbox and the different properties that we can use to align different elements in different situations like the ones that I showed you up until this point. Now there's a lot more content to come and a lot more Flexbox to use, so stay tuned for all of these lectures that are to follow. See you next time. Hey there! Let's now build the sidebar and the navigation of our app. And so we will once more build a really cool hover effect that I already showed you before. And for that, I'm going to show you how to use transform with scale Y and how to transition multiple properties with different settings. Plus, you're going to learn how and why to use the current color variable and how to use even more advanced Flexbox alignment techniques. So let's get to work. So the sidebar that I'm talking about is of course this one here. So up here we have our navigation with this nice hover effect that I was talking about. And then down here we just have some copyright text, okay? So that is what we're going to do in this lecture. And as always, let's start with the HTML markup. So we have our nav here. Let's give it some space here. And then let's start. So the navigation as usual is an unordered list. Okay. And I'm calling it side nav. So for the side navigation, of course. Then in here, each of the navigation elements is of course an list item, and it has the name side nav, which is the block, and then the element name is simply item. Okay, and then in here, of course, the anchor element. So side nav link with the href going to nowhere. And then in here, we finally have our icon and our text. So we do this exactly the same way we did before. So SVG with the class side nav icon, and then in here we use the use element. So xlink href, and then we want our sprite SVG. And now let's take a look at which icon we actually want. So the first one is this house. Then we have the flight, then the key, and then here this map. So first up is the one called icon home. And so remember, all we have to do is to now set the hash icon here, and that's it. Close it, and here we go. So again, this is the best way of using SVGs in HTML by only including one SVG